Right at the moment, China has almost 60 units of nuclear reactors. And right at the moment, China also has about 30 reactors under construction. In contrast, the United States does have, close to 100 units online for the commercial power generations, but zero under construction right at the moment.
My name is Darrin Magee. I'm director of the Institute for Energy Studies at Western Washington University in lovely Bellingham, Washington. And I'm pleased to introduce our guests for today's discussion on nuclear energy. We have Jane Nakano, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She focuses on energy security and climate change issues. And Nick Touran, a nuclear engineer, reactor designer, nuclear educator, consultant who spent 16 years at TerraPower working on next generation reactor design. So I want to start off this morning. Thank you both again for doing this. With a very brief introduction, maybe Nick, you can lead us off on this to nuclear power. I suspect most of our listeners will know the basics, that it's either about slamming small atoms into each other, fusion, or splitting big ones apart for fission. But what more can you tell us about nuclear energy in general?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Happy to be here. Sure. So, energy in general, everybody knows this, but I like just to frame it, energy is a replacement for the labor of humans and animals. So, like, if we can get energy from natural resources, that frees us up to do whatever we want, while the energy takes care of our lifestyle and our needs and things like that. So, energy is this very tied to quality of life type of thing that's very important. So that's just a starting point. And nuclear is one form of energy alongside fossil fuel and renewables and many others. Nuclear, the energy is stored in the atoms. As you already talked about fusion and fission, we are still working on figuring out how to slam atoms together and get net energy out. Fusion, it's an ongoing, very active research program. It's been going on since the 50s. We hope to see progress on it soon and get power plants from it, but today just about 5% of world energy comes from splitting larger atoms, fission. And it's about 20% of the electricity in the United States, about 5% of total energy worldwide. So this came out of the nuclear weapons program in the Manhattan Project. Like, first we harnessed that energy as a nuclear explosive, and then soon after that, we were able to turn that sort of destructive energy into a more peaceful type of energy source by turning it into power plants. And the way you do that is basically just boiling water. You take these atoms, you arrange them into a machine called a nuclear reactor that's set up to split the atoms in a controlled way. You can turn the reactions up and down, and they generate heat. That heat is coming out of the nuclei of those atoms, uranium or thorium or plutonium, and it just heats up something. And what you do is you pump a coolant, some kind of fluid, almost always water, but there are many other options, and we'll probably talk about those. You can do gas, liquid metal, molten salt, and that coolant picks up the heat and it transfers it over basically to a boiler, which would then boil water, and the steam then goes off and spins a turbine. It's like steam blowing through a pinwheel, basically. The turbine is hooked up to a shaft that's hooked up to a generator that spins magnets, and the magnets push electrons around, and we send that out on the transmission grid to make electricity. And so after you make the heat, it's really no different from any other thermal kind of power plant. So it's just a very exotic way of making electricity, or
Right,
boiling
cool.
water, I should say.
Right, a fancy way of boiling water, right? And
Yes,
so indeed,
exactly.
and no different from a hydroelectric plant where you've got the force of gravity pulling water over that turbine, spinning the
Exactly.
generator. Same idea. So it's all about, at least for these types of generators, spinning a turbine and getting electrons motivated to move through conductors.
Yep.
Jane, can you talk a little bit about the current state of nuclear capacity in China and the United States? Obviously, two behemoths in terms of nuclear energy and civilian nuclear ambitions. The United States, long a leader in production and capacity of nuclear power, but of course, kind of stalled. We're very slow to build nuclear plants right now, and often joke as a China watcher that, during the time of our discussion today, China will build more nuclear capacity or more energy capacity in general than the United States will in the next year. So, Jane, I'd appreciate your perspective as somebody who looks at energy issues and as they overlap with national security and such. Just a quick overview of where China and the US stand in terms of nuclear capacity.
Sure. Thanks, Darren. The US and China both are two of the very few countries that have been generating electricity from nuclear, but have very different stories right at the moment. China, the first power generating nuclear unit came online roughly around like 1980. And then for a while, there wasn't that big of a momentum initially, but in the last, at least decade or decade and a half, the construction has been expanding just, in an impressive rate. Right at the moment, China has almost 60 units of nuclear reactors. And right at the moment, China also has about 30 reactors under construction. In contrast, the United States does have, close to 100 units online for the commercial power generation. So, 94 units to be exact, but zero under construction right at the moment. And as you mentioned, Darren, the last time the US had the new unit completed was a couple years ago at Vogtle, units 3 and 4. But there has been very little new orders, and that's, it has a lot to do with the economics of power generation, interfuel competition vis-a-vis natural gas. Since the so-called shale gas revolution happened about 15 years ago, but also renewables are fast growing. Of course, China is also adding a lot of renewables, but nuclear has also become a very important source of electricity for China as China seeks to decarbonize its energy system, including in the power generation. But just a quick comparison, even with this, 60, roughly 60 units online, I think nuclear accounts for roughly 5% of China's power generation mix. In the United States, 94 units account for roughly 20% of the power generation or power supply at the moment. But certainly, China also has roughly 30 units under construction, but the current plan is to start adding about 10 units annually for many years to come.
A staggering figure and a staggering rate. I heard Nick laugh just a little bit there. I'm wondering if that is just because of that kind of capacity addition rate. 30 units annually is something that it's just hard to wrap our heads around here in the United States. Um, Nick, I want to circle back to you. So Jane touched on the economics question. She touched on the potential role of nuclear in providing zero emission electricity, a strategic interest for China, certainly. Can you talk a little bit about, and I know I'm really having to drag it out of you. You hate talking about nuclear energy, Nick. Can you talk a little bit about how nuclear compares to other low emission sources in terms of stability, cost,
Yeah.
scalability? I know one of the frequent sells, of course, is that you turn it on and leave it on, except for
Yeah.
fuel changes every 18 months or so.
Yeah, it's very intriguing, and it's gotten a lot more interesting in the last just handful of years because we're now seeing talks of significant load growth yet again. And it's load growth. The big talk is about AI data centers, which have a load profile which is like they come on and they're many gigawatts per facility, and they basically want power all the time. They want power at night. They want power in the calm season. And so one thing that nuclear can do. So there's a bunch of low emitting sources, the low carbon sources, solar, hydro, geothermal, wind, nuclear. And nuclear among those is the one that nuclear and geothermal are kind of unique in that they can run all the time, regardless of season, regardless of weather conditions and anything like that. And nuclear is unique in that it's the one that can be built pretty much anywhere. Geothermal at the moment needs pretty specific sites, although people are working on getting rid of that limitation. But nuclear is kind of the low emitting source that you can build almost anywhere. It uses a very tiny amount of land. It doesn't need it doesn't need nearly as much transmission. When you build like a wind farm, you have to run transmission lines to a very wide dispersed area that's going to collect the electricity from many different smaller wind turbines. Where when you build a nuclear plant, you kind of have one big transmission line that goes from the plant into the main distribution parts of the grid. And so it's a lot easier to hook up a nuclear plant in terms of like how many transmission lines you need. And then this idea that it can run 24/7 is really great. So that's kind of the major advantage. Another interesting thing about it is that, yeah, you can store 2 years of fuel like in the building compared to like coal. You have to bring a mile-long coal train every day to keep a gigawatt scale coal plant online. Whereas with nuclear, you bring in a truckload every 18 months of nuclear fuel. And this is because the physics advantage of nuclear bonds compared to chemical bonds are so much, there's so much more energy per bond. Yes, so nuclear in general is pretty expensive, and it's very capital intensive. So there's a big upfront payment to build a large, complicated plant. And then after you have it up and running, the operation and maintenance costs are relatively low. They're not dirt cheap. You still have to pay like a security staff, for instance, that's more significant than at different types of plants. The fuel costs are extremely low. Nuclear fuel cost is only 5 to 10% of total cost of nuclear compared to like, 80+% for gas or something that's like using huge amounts of fuel. And as you said, the nuclear economics vary dramatically based on where you're building them and how good that country is at building large scale mega projects. And so we've seen terrible experiences in the United States recently, and in the UK and in France recently, and in Finland, all the new builds have sort of boondoggled way, doubled or more beyond their initial estimate and taken at least, 50% longer than they were supposed to take. And a lot of that is thought to be related to we sort of got out of the rhythm of it. We hadn't built them for a long time, and we just have to like reestablish that supply chain that can build them. And there's a lot of thought that like if you sort of pick a certain design and build numerous copies of it, that the cost of each one is going to go down pretty significantly if you could actually do that. The examples where we've seen that is in like France in the 70s and 80s, where they built out 50 plants basically of the same design in 15 years. And they were, the cost consistency was much better for those types of plants. And then we've seen in the late 90s, Japan built very advanced, very fancy nuclear reactors in 36 months, record-breaking times. They like really figured it out. This sort of integrated group of people, Hitachi, who sort of did the design and managed the construction. They were able to deliver nuclear plants relatively cheaply. And South Korea can build them very cheaply. They just built 4 in the United Arab Emirates. They came together really nicely. And China is building them extremely effectively. They're building them quickly. They want to do 10 a year, which I was sort of laughing because it's so impressive. It's such a, that's the number that the United States wants to be at or beyond. But they're there, like they're now delivering these plants, and they're putting them out like clockwork. And since they've sort of established a full supply chain, and they have people who have built the last one a month ago, they know exactly how they put together. And so they're seeing really great construction economics. And so the economics is all over the place. It's bad in the West, it's excellent in other places. And so there's a lot to sort of take out of that. And nuclear economics competing with natural gas is extremely hard. I mean, natural gas is this very simple power plant. It's a jet engine bolted to the ground with a throttle.
Especially as long as you're not counting the cost of carbon, right?
Exactly.
And so that math will never work out.
And so when you when you look at the overall externalities combined, there's a lot of reason to say that like nuclear is a perfectly reasonably, it's well within economics, especially for the low emitting power sources.
Jane, I'd love to get you in on the supply chain issues. Part of energy security, at least as I understand it, is the national security in general on whatever, food security, energy security, water security. is the ability of a country, of a nation state, to be able to meet their supply chain needs. We've of course seen a lot of this since COVID, with whether it's tractor parts or medicines or whatever. What can you say that your work at CIS has done? I'd love to hear your perspective on the supply chains, and including, if you can speak to it, the fuel supply chain for both countries.
Mm,
That's a
sure.
lot.
Well, no, but there's a lot happening in China. And earlier, so China added roughly 3 dozen units the last decade, 2010 through 2020 or so. And I think earlier on there was still a lot of the different designs from the West, including the U.S., but also France, some Can-Do from Canada, and also Russia. And there was a lot of a learning process. But fast forward now, roughly 90%, or if actually like could be like mid 90s, 90% of technologies that went into some of the recent units, not just the large scale, but some of the large scale sort of third generation reactors, but some of the more recent advanced or small modulars are said to be, sort of indigenous or domestically supplied. So the supply chain expansion is maturing quite quickly. The I guess, and then of course, human resources is a really important type of supply chain concern, as Nick already mentioned. Having people that have like that hands-on experience from recent projects that very much contribute to the ability to keep the costs down and be able to really take advantage of all these things that you learn from not just manufacturing perspective, but like also assembly. The and in comparison, the United States has had very slow sort of a domestic fleet expansion in recent decades. And during the last administration, there was a pretty comprehensive study on the nuclear supply chains, and that did cover a lot of different aspects, including human resources, but also things like large scale forging capacity. But the earlier conversation, and then there's also sort of a national security aspect to this discussion, because the U.S. government and led by Commerce Department has been sort of updating or I guess expanding the scope of export restrictions concerning nuclear materials to China. I think the some of the reactions that we're starting to read out of China is that it's not going to hurt them as much because of the level of localization that the Chinese industry has achieved. And in some sense, export control may also speed up the domestic effort within China to really quickly acquire some of the expertise, and also keep supporting the innovation efforts as well. So, it's, we can get into the export control, as a separate topic or not, but, there's definitely sort of a, linkage to the future of the bilateral relationship, if you will.
Let's talk about the policy environment a little bit, because, of course, in the United States, under the Biden administration, the perspective on nuclear or on low carbon energy in general was largely driven by climate concerns. Infrastructure Act, of course, was supportive of those kinds of build outs. Not so much the same perspective on climate right now in the current administration, but nevertheless, a lot of support for energy, for nuclear energy. I guess maybe I'll toss this at both of you in whichever order you want to take it, but help us understand a little bit the comparative domestic policy context that is fueling, if you will, nuclear buildouts in China and optimism in the United States.
I can certainly speak to the United States, at least from a policy point of view, for starters. Yeah, so nuclear is almost unique in that it has quite strong bipartisan support. It was heavily pushed by the Biden administration, and it's been extremely heavily pushed by the Trump administration, from completely different perspectives, as you said. One for low carbon, low emissions, and now for like energy abundance and energy dominance, vast amounts of electricity quickly, sort of not at all interested in the low carbon, but sure, like if it can make a huge amount of electricity quickly without using a bunch of resources, great. So the policies that are in place, I mean, a lot of them across both on both sides of the aisle have been related to the advanced and small modular reactors. There's most of the interest is in that type of reactor, I would say. So there's major programs established under the Biden administration to develop what we call advanced types of reactors. So they're, rather than being cooled and moderated with water, they're types of reactors that have different types of fluids coming through, like a gas or a molten salt or a liquid metal, as I was alluding to earlier. And those types of reactors are less mature. We ran them in the old days, like in the 50s, and the water cooled reactors perform better, and were easier to maintain and more reliable. And so we shut all those programs down and water dominated. But those reactors still have some intriguing capabilities. They can go to higher temperature, and they have potential to be, I mean, smaller may improve the economics if you can do more of it in a factory and so on. So anyway, there's major programs going on with big US companies that are sort of 50-50 cost share private public partnerships. And those have been continued under the Trump administration. And actually, and then additional programs have just been brought in under the 4 executive orders that were nuclear related that came out, I guess, back in April. And those are really pushing for, like, there's one, like right now there's a bunch of companies, 10 companies are scrambling to build a small critical reactor by July 4th, 2026, which is like, absurdly fast. But like they are saying, like, we will like clear the path. It's going to be a tiny reactor, so we don't have that many safety concerns. They're extra safe reactors anyway. And so let's just stop talking about it and start building these little reactors. And so there's a bunch of focus on getting those guys up and running. And I think at first I was like, they aren't going to be great reactors. They're going to need a lot of debugging. But on the other hand, like just getting something critical to try to get some momentum and getting some of that hands-on experience, it's so much more valuable than just studying, has some merit to it. And then the sort of big workhorse reactors, there is still support for. The IRA had tax credits that's prevented shutdowns of some of the bigger plants that are up and running, and now we're seeing restarts. Sorry.
Gigawatt scale.
Yes, the gigawatt scale, the 100 plants that we have that are like gigawatt scale. So now we're seeing things we've never seen before, like taking a plant that was shut down and restarting it, or going to a plant that construction was canceled and picking up construction of it again. And this is again driven by these massive electricity demand increase projections, and these are being supported by the Trump administration now.
Gotcha. So data centers, heating, electrification, penetration of electric vehicles. Jane, how about China? What can you say about the policy context there that's supporting the nuclear build out in that country?
Sure. I think, it's still very much driven by China's desire to really meet the net zero 2060 commitment, to really, reduce the share of coal, which still is quite dominant, roughly
Hmm.
60%, both in the energy mix, but then also electricity mix.
Hmm.
And but then I think it's also, they recognize that it is very, sort of a base load resource. And, as Nick, also pointed out, very small, very limited land footprint as well. But I think there's also a lot that we don't in the West haven't really know, they have like good insights into. I think, one of the reasons why both Biden administration and the Trump administration have been tightening the export control is the use of some of these, the nuclear in the military domain, right? The sort of this, military civil fusion initiative that the Chinese government has had for quite a while by now. And, nuclear is a dual use technology. So, there's the whatever expertise that a country has in civil nuclear generation side, and even this, some of the supply chain, including fuel, it could be, supporting non-civilian side of national objectives. But I think, the nuclear, and I think under the current 5-year plan, which, ends this year, the future target is to have 200 gigawatts of, install capacity by 2035. But even then, I think given the huge, power need that China has, I think the, share of nuclear in China's, power supply won't really go beyond 8 to 9%.
Hard to imagine hitting a 20% figure like we
Exactly.
currently have in the United States.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But if I could just quickly also mention about some of the AI needs, I think in China's some of the policy planning that that China is looking at also reusing much more renewables to meet its data center and AI needs. And I
Hmm.
think it's sort of a experiment that's underway. So I don't think there's any sort of immediate outcome per se, but looking at the tie-ups between all these hyperscalers and nuclear companies, it's that could that could make some of the Trump administration goals a little more realistic, perhaps. The Even though like many of these targets are extremely ambitious, as Nick pointed
Mm.
out, but with the hyperscalers coming in, bringing some of the once retired plant back online, and also trying to give lifelines to the existing large scale ones, as well as giving capital infusion into some of the up and coming or the small modular advanced reactor companies that are still trying to get to the finish line and come to the commercial deployment. So the landscape is fast changing for sure.
I am struck as a China scholar and a longtime energy nerd, now talking to energy nerds, with how different the politicis well how energy is much seems much less renewables in particular seems much less politicized in China. If it generates electricity cheaply, then let's do it and let's do lots of it. Whereas here, in the United States, there's such an about face in the past 6 months on our 8 months or so on our renewable build out that was a quite an impressive build out. It remains to be seen whether there's a change in that. Nick, I know you said you wanted to talk about the waste issue, so I will give you 2 minutes um, to to talk about the waste issue and answer the question fusion by 28 question mark, yes or no. Um,
Okay.
I will say that the joke is that right, fusion has been around the corner for half a century or so,
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
around the corner. Are we actually closer? I've heard recently some pretty interesting arguments that advances in late things like lasers and magnets, high power magnets that could actually control the fusion reaction may may really mean that we are kind of starting to see around the corner there.
Yeah. Okay. So just on waste briefly, I mean, so yeah, nuclear waste is still the number one thing people ask when I go out promoting nuclear power. They, well, what about the waste? It's, highly
Mm.
toxic and it's toxic for a long time. And one sort of just off the bat, interesting point is like most toxic waste, like mercury, is toxic forever. It never goes
Mm.
away. Like its half-life is infinity. Whereas nuclear waste is like almost unique in that it goes away over time. It like becomes non-toxic as time goes on. So it's funny that people always say it lasts a long time, even though it's the only kind that goes away on its own.
Well,
um, but it certainly is
okay.
toxic. It certainly is toxic material when it comes out of a reactor. But one thing about it is it's extremely, because of the nuclear bonds and how much energy is in them, there's a very tiny amount of nuclear waste per electricity that we generate. And so, like the stats go, if you got all of your electricity or all of your not just electricity, but your total energy, including like house heating, transportation fuel for your entire life, you would be responsible for generating a soda can of high level nuclear waste per lifetime, an 87-year lifetime. And that's toxic material, but it's extremely small compared to millions of Coke cans if you're using a fossil fuel. And right
Huh.
now, fossil fuel emissions, particulates, SOx and NOx, air pollutants are dumped into the atmosphere. I mean, through filters and so on, but still the waste is just dumped out because it's so massive that we breathe it in. And it now, according to World Health Organization, causes about 8 million premature deaths per year from air pollution. Whereas, and not to mention climate change. Whereas nuclear, the waste is basically in these Coke cans. We have it very well contained. Since it's so small, we keep track of every single atom of it. It screams out where it is, so you always know if it's leaking. Any high school, with a detector can go out and see if it's leaking anywhere. So it's very easy to keep track of. We have very geologically stable. The geologists of the world agree that if you put it in crystalline bedrock, like Finland is just opening the world's first commercial nuclear waste repository, and they studied it for years. They developed it, they tested it, and it's perfectly appropriate, and they're doing it. And so that's a fine solution. And so to take the nuclear waste, put it 500 meters into crystalline bedrock and seal it up is appropriate, and it'll save 8 million lives per year, and it'll prevent climate change. So in my opinion, yeah, it's an issue, but it's a solvable issue, and it shouldn't prevent us from expanding this power source because of sort of the relative differences. And then on fusion, I started in fusion. I got into nuclear because of fusion. I thought, no, fission's going to be faster. I'm going to work on that. I think I hope there will be a revolution, but I want to see net power first. We're nowhere near net power. We got net power in a little tiny, there was a headline that said we got break even, but that's scientific break even. It's not real break even. It's 400x away from real break even. So I'm so excited. There are billions of dollars going in. Something good is going to come out, but let's wait till we have net power, and then we'll see if we can build an actual power plant around it. We'll see if that power plant is anywhere near economical, even if the fuel's free. I already said nuclear fission fuel is only 5% of the total cost. So let's see what the power plant costs. So let's not bank on it. We shouldn't rely on it, but it's worth working on, and I hope we see something good out of it soon.
Jane, I'll ask you the question that's going to make the nuclear engineering and nuclear waste question sound like an easy one. Cooperation by 2028. Are there areas where you see the United States and China being able to cooperate on any aspect of the nuclear picture, whether that's fuel, managing fuel, complicated, increasingly complicated, I would think, fuel chains, fuel supply chains, if we're talking about wide proliferation of small modular reactors, even some of them may be floating in the ocean. So what can you say about potential for cooperation between these two civilian nuclear powers?
Yeah, this is not an easy question. I mean, a decade ago, or even maybe a decade and a half ago, we had a lot more robust cooperation across the board, and then including in nuclear with AP1000 technologies, headed to China. A lot of exchange among engineers and regulators. As an optimist, I'd like to say that the exchange and conversation dialogues between two regulators have to continue, whether, if the, sort of a strictly sort of bilateral government to government isn't exactly the most convenient format, perhaps through, IAEA as a platform. I think there are a lot of lessons learned that the United States regulators and also, a lot of technical experts can get from the Chinese regulators as they continue to add some large scale, but then China reportedly has floating nuclear, some of the multi-purpose SMRs that supply both, heat and electricity. So that should be really the area. And I think, that you have to be able to speak on these, if I think it's in the interest of both countries to see any potential newcomers to the nuclear field in a lot of, in the developing world, they would benefit from the highest regulatory standards, and also to the extent that we can really have shared norms in communicating any incidents, accidents. It will benefit nuclear as a whole. Any accident in one country it's really can really bring down the prospect of nuclear benefiting the entire globe. So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's my
Okay,
optimistic prognosis.
so I'm hearing cautious optimism on cooperation, cautious optimism on fusion, cautious optimism on waste management solutions. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I really hope to have the chance to talk with you both more at some point in the future. Thank you both for joining me in this conversation today, and would especially like to thank the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations for hosting this event. I look forward to the next one.